Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show from Carnegie Hall, New York City. And this is the first of a trilogy of programs on the contribution of Scots to modern America. We start here in the hall built by Andrew Carnegie, who has a great claim to be the most influential of all Scots on modern America. He became the world's richest man through honest endeavour and ruthless ambition, and then he proceeded to almost invent the concept of philanthropy and gave his fortune away, because in the precepts of Andrew Carnegie's faith, he who dies rich dies shamed. So we conduct interviews to talk about Andrew Carnegie's contribution and the wider contribution of Scots. But first, over to Tasmina with your emails, your tweets and your messages.
First we hear from Graham Goodall, who suggests an interview with a Canadian journalist, but also goes on to say, "Love your in Tasmina show. Breath of fresh air in a smoky room." Well, that's very kind of you indeed. Last week, of course, Alex interviewed Lord Daffyd Wigley, and Fiona says, "Enjoyed hearing the Plight historic perspective from Daffyd Wigley. Great interview, as was Alec Neil exchange of previous week. Very much a regular 7:30 Thursday AM must-see for me and many others, I suspect." Bryce Hugh says, "Fascinating interview with the Right Honourable Lord Wigley on the Alex Salmond Show. Looking forward to the USA shows. Keep up the good work, Alex and Tasmina." And finally, Maureen says, "Really enjoyed this week's show with Welsh Lord, but a Lord for a reason, something we do not think about. Brilliant." Now, Alex is in New York at Carnegie Hall, speaking with Gino Francesconi, the Director of Archives there.
Gino, I've got my seat in the stalls here.
So welcome to Carnegie Hall, Alex.
Thank you so much, Gino.
You know the joke, how do you get to Carnegie Hall?
Which is?
Some buy a ticket, but some have to have their own show.
Now, listen, you started as an usher here.
I did.
Where were you?
All the way up there to that back light. I was in the balcony, October 1, 1974. I remember calling my father saying, I heard Ella Fitzgerald and they were paying me $6 a night.
And was $6, was that it, or were there tips? Or
No tips, just
tip-
$6.
$6.
The tips started when I was working backstage.
And so how did you survive in $6 a night? Was that okay?
We were able to do it. My rent was $187 a month.
Okay.
In Midtown Manhattan. Doesn't make any sense now, does it?
No, as I work at, you're $7 short if there's 30 days in the month. And if I'm buying a ticket,
Right.
okay, for a performance here, where would you suggest would be the ultimate? Where's the sweet spot?
For myself, when there's going to be a wonderful performance, I go all the way back up there.
Where you started?
The sound goes up there and it shoots right out.
And we're going to the research.
Let's go up to the research room.
Straight question. Andrew Carnegie, the most influential Scot of all time on American history. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. He did so much for this country that we know of with the various institutions, the libraries, the philanthropies, but there are also aspects which a lot of people may not be aware of. For example, the Hero Fund that he instituted, where if someone was has been discovered to do a heroic act, they were given a sum of money and a medal. And over 9,000 people were given some money and a medal. And when we started the archives here, people assumed that Carnegie Hall had to deal with the Andrew Carnegie Corporation, so people were calling to get information about Grandpa's medal and Grandpa's certificate. And I didn't know what they were talking about, and then I discovered that there were nearly 10,000 people whose lives were changed across the country because Andrew Carnegie had heard they had done a heroic act.
So Carnegie built up, he was the world's richest man
At the
by
time.
some distance. And he built up an industrial combine and an empire, but spent as much time, maybe more time, giving away his fortune as he did amassing it in the first place.
He said that someone who dies rich dies disgraced. I don't know when he came up with that, but he felt that someone should spend the first third of their life becoming educated, the second third of their life making money, and then the third part of their life giving it away. And it was when he was inspired to do this, he became unstoppable. He was as aggressive with the way he gave his money away as he was in business.
And he was pretty aggressive in business. I mean, what was dictating him was a Presbyterian ethic. Justification by faith. I mean, I recognize this as a Presbyterian. Justification by faith, and I've seen the acquisition of wealth is an indication of the justification of your faith.
That's right.
And as is the philanthropy, which he effectively invented for the modern age,
right,
and the giving it away. But also part of that was the ruthless way he built up his business empire. So how did you think Carnegie squared the actions perhaps he had to take by necessity to become the world's richest man with this faith which was driving him on?
You know, to me, it's all common sense. This common sense that he had, that it wasn't so much, I'm going to make money, I'm going to have the largest corporation in the world. He was thinking, I need to do this, and how can I do it by the most economical way? And he practically invented the monopoly. Why can't I have my own ships? Why can't I have my own trains? Why can't I have my own coal mines? And it wasn't because it'll make me wealthier, it'll bring the costs of whatever I'm doing down. And he could spread it around and reinvest. And in fact, even funding a place like this, Carnegie Hall, was the location to many people was ill-advised. The architect was unknown, and he built it with the idea perhaps a choir will use it, but there are 3 theaters in this building. What was he thinking when Midtown at this time was still 2.8 miles south of here and there was no transportation? He knew, he could feel something, and I think this transcends religion, it transcends philosophy. It was a feeling, I think, and that's unique, really. To me, he's as much as I've now felt I know Andrew for almost 32 years, and he's still an enigma in a lot of ways, because how would you invent monopoly or create the monopoly and then build 3,500 libraries free for the common man all over the world?
Which was probably based on his own childhood experience in Dunfermline, where
right,
he couldn't get access to the public library because his status in life was too lowly.
That's right.
So when he bought the library in Dunfermline, and as you say, thousands around the world,
his first gift was a library to the town of Dunfermline, and then he bought the yard that belonged to the laird, and he opened it up to the public. And you know, I don't know if it's a moment where he goes, I'm now guilt-free. I don't think he thought that way at all.
But then his activities, the provision of educational opportunity,
right,
the first third of your life, as you put it, to be educated. But also the general philanthropy. It was all philanthropy with a purpose, wasn't it? It was all, yeah. He invented the concept of joint giving. So give us an example.
You know, I mean, you know the saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for the day, teach a man to fish and you fed him for life. And this was Carnegie's philosophy in terms of giving. I mean, he thought, why should I give you $1 if you're going to spend it and then that's going to be the end of it? He would say, I'll build you a library, but I want the city to fill it with books. I want them over there to pay for the funding of the staff. And then I want a group to get together and give 10% every year to the maintenance of this library. They weren't expensive by any means. I think the libraries cost anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 back then. And he would hire the architect and buy the land, but he wanted a group of people together to help maintain it, because he said, I didn't want this to be a waste of time after I'm gone.
And this philanthropy, of course, was based on the world's greatest first. He was richer than, well, Bill Gates is now.
Yeah, he, at one point, not right away, but when he sold his Carnegie Steel Corporation to J.P. Morgan, and then J.P. Morgan, you know, he went and bought the other steel mills all the way up the river, and that became U.S. Steel, which is still around today. For a little bit of time, anyway, Carnegie had nearly $400 million. And at that time, $1 was worth anywhere between $25 and $30 of our money today. So imagine that multiplied. And I've heard Bill Gates say that what Carnegie had back then was more than he could ever imagine. And he must have some pretty big imaginations, you know, I mean, and for him to realize that the buying power that he had, the guys who built this place were making $1 a day. So imagine.
So, and people like Gates, of course, have been influenced by Carnegie, and part of the ethos of many of the great new companies, the tech companies, have been dictated by that Carnegie philosophy.
That's right. And you know, one of my favorite aspects of this is that he, as a boy, got involved with the high tech of the day, the telegraph. You know, it came out in strips, and someone would write it out, and it was "Run, boy," and he was the boy, and he ran everywhere. And then at one point he thought, why do I have to wait for that old guy to write it out? And he memorized the sound. And he was one of the first to do that. And the vice president of the railroad company saw this and thought, that kid is smart, I want him with me. And I want him to teach all these boys how to do this because the Civil War was going to break out. And telegraph was the main means of communication. Yeah. And what was interesting to me, I got an actual chill when I saw that in one of the notes at the Library of Congress at his papers, because his beginnings up the ladder began with sound, and he would ultimately fund this building, which is known for its sound.
So Carnegie's attitudes forged in Scotland, but basically made in the United States of America in terms of the opportunity he was able to create for himself.
I mean, you could see it in the beginnings there. His father was a bit of a rabble-rouser, you know, during the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and he was working with the Bobbins, and they were going to mechanize, and he thought, there's no future here for me. And there was a relative of his mother's living in Pittsburgh, and as so many people did, my parents included, after the war, came to America, you know, and they just happened to take the long way. It took 10 weeks. When you think about it, it's extraordinary. They went across the Atlantic, up the Hudson River, across the Erie Canal, across the Great Lakes, and then down into Pittsburgh. It's extraordinary when you think about that voyage, you know. And then, what did he do? Just like his father, he started in the bobbin business. Oil, greasy hands, he was making $1.20 a week, you know. And then never stopped moving. Little Andy was ahead of the class everywhere. He kept working and working, and when he started with the telegraph, there was no looking back. In fact, one of his supervisors said, give me one of your quarters, I'll invest it for you. And Carnegie writes to his mother, I made 2 cents off the sweat of somebody else's brow. And he never looked back.
Welcome back to the Carnegie Hall, New York, where I'm speaking to Gino Francesconi, the director of the Rose Museum. Gino started work at Carnegie as an usher in 1974, became its archivist in 1986, and over the last 30 years he has collected over 300,000 pieces of memorabilia about Carnegie Hall from all over the world. Gino is showing me some of his prize exhibits. Well, I recognize this chap here.
Isn't that amazing? It's Charlie Chaplin for a benefit during the war. And then look at this. It's one of my favorite shots. It's Maria Callas's Carnegie Hall debut in 1959.
You can see in her eyes. I mean, she likes being here, that's for sure.
Yeah, look at that. It's remarkable. The photographer told me there were 8 other singers on stage, but he couldn't take his eyes off her.
So he's only shot once.
And look at this. This is the way the hall looked when it opened in 1891. Look, we had front steps, and the street was only 2 lanes wide.
Well, tell me about the figure in the...
I'm not sure, you know, photography took 5 minutes. You had to stand absolutely still. If somebody was walking by, it was captured like a ghost.
Like a ghost. Yeah.
Sometimes they say that in old photography, when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was here, for example, they had...
That looks like a ghost of Carnegie.
It does. This is a poster from opening night.
All right.
President...
Inauguration of the Music Hall founded by Andrew Carnegie.
You see, it's not Carnegie Hall. And there's Tchaikovsky at the top, and Andrew's down here.
Carnegie, I mean, obviously from the design of this hall, the halls, he
Right.
knew that this was going to
Sure.
encompass the wide range of arts.
I mean, when you look inside, it seats almost 3,000 people, and then there are two other halls. He was thinking of something more than a choir.
Yes.
You know. And this is this room that we're in from 1898.
But listen, you've collected a fair amount of memorabilia over the years.
Yes, we have. When we started 32 years ago, it's hard to believe, but there was almost nothing here. There were some items, but thanks to the generosity of thousands of people across the country, when they heard we were looking for material, they sent it in. And people saved programs or posters or ticket stubs or photographs.
How much have you got now?
Now we have about 300,000 pieces.
300,000.
Yeah.
And how do people, members of the public, get to see that? How do they?
Well, we are actually now digitizing a lot of it, and soon it'll be available to the public. But for the moment, we have a museum here on site, which is open every day to the public. It's free of charge. And we have about 300 pieces on display there. Everything from Toscanini's baton to Benny Goodman's clarinet.
But when he was envisaging this great hall, and halls really, I mean, he was, as you said, built it somewhere which, for those who didn't understand that New York was going to expand, would have seemed strange. But was he thinking, you know, this will bring culture, this will bring the great stars to the masses, or was he thinking religiously? I mean, the choral aspect of the original. What was in his mind when he built this great great theatre of art?
When they made the announcement that there was going to be this cornerstone laying ceremony, and Carnegie was going to be here with his relatively new wife, younger, you know, and all of musical New York was coming up here, and the public came up here first to see, where are we, and what is he going to do? And then he starts off by giving this grand speech, and at one point he says, it is probable that this hall will intertwine itself with the history of our country. And people were thinking, what? And it was remarkable because he could see what was happening in New York. He saw that the city was rapidly advancing up Fifth Avenue. And while there were some people saying, why has he put that building all the way up there? There were others calling their real estate agents saying, see if you can find me a piece of land up there real fast. And he saw that this was one of the last streets before Central Park cuts the city in half. People were saying, who's going to go all the way up there, you know? I mean, on the east side, at this time, I think the population was 5,000. On the west side, it was even less, because it's hard to imagine now, but there were rocks between us and the west side, these large promontories of Manhattan schist.
At a fairly early stage, the great artists of the day started to appear. So, but Carnegie knew pretty early on that his vision was coming to pass.
Well, I think it started a little bit. I mean, we started with a bang, really, because we invited Peter Tchaikovsky, who was the greatest living composer of the day. He actually came and conducted 6 of his different works. The publicity that was generated by this was brilliant, because people came. There was a 5-day music festival, and it was sold out. We had 2 Thomson Houston dynamos installed in the basement, and on nights when we didn't have concerts, we were selling electrical power to the city of New York, just to help finance the building, you know. But then it started, and it started with a Polish pianist by the name of Paderewski, first prime minister of Poland. And it was actually our location that made us, that started our magic. It's really a very interesting story.
And the great, Hirimanyan, for example, they probably commented on the acoustics,
Right.
especially violinists, which are legendary in terms of the purity.
Yes, in fact, Tchaikovsky, it's really interesting, in a little notebook he wrote, he bought, it says, notes for New York. Number 1, is it safe to drink the water in America? Number 2, do they have Russian cigarettes there? Number 3, check acoustics, the new music hall. And then he circles them with an exclamation point. They're good.
So your own history with this hall, how did you start?
I started as an usher here in 1974. I wanted to be a conductor. And while auditioning to any music school that would take me, I saw somebody who said, oh, you have to be an usher at Carnegie Hall because there are so many different types of concerts. You're going to learn a lot of music very quickly. And in fact, it was brilliant. I became an usher, went up to the balcony. My first week, I heard Ella Fitzgerald and the Chicago Symphony, and they were paying me. And then I became the artist attendant backstage, where now I had to greet Ella Fitzgerald at the door, bring her to the dressing room and get her to the stage. And I did that for about 3,000 concerts.
And give me a memory of one of these great stars who you greeted at the door.
Oh gosh, the first time that I saw Frank Sinatra, it was a humbling experience because he was, it was a wonderful thing to see him interacting with members of the band and how he knew every note of every work. He made it seem so easy. You know, it was the same way with Leonard Bernstein. He didn't look at any of the music. And you thought, well, they must be faking some of it, but it was because it was so much a part of their blood and so much a part of their being. They just made it look easy, you know. It was a brilliant university for me. If I had only known that I was going to become Carnegie Hall's first historian, I would have taken notes back there. Because
it'd make a pretty good book, Gino.
Yeah, it would.
But the last part of his life was basically dedicated to world peace.
That's right.
And when he went back to Scotland, he decanted back to Scotland effectively, ran what was left of the empire by then from Skibo Castle, which in the Highlands of Scotland emerged as this ultra-modern, in the Edwardian age, this, with electricity and electric taxis from Chicago and amazing swimming pools. And it started to invite, effectively, the crown heads of Europe.
That's right.
To conferences in Skibo, if he wasn't visiting them, to tell them, for goodness sake,
right,
get out of these grand alliances because it's going to end in catastrophe.
That's right. In fact, he brilliantly started off, you know, and they called, in the press, they called it dinosaur diplomacy, because in 1904, they discovered at the time in Wyoming, the world's largest dinosaur. And Carnegie funded it. In fact, they named it after him. It's still called the Duplicitous Carnegie today. People couldn't believe that it was true, that something could be so big. And he started to make plaster casts of it. And he had one put in Skibo. And when these crown heads of Europe came, they thought, what is that? He said, I'll give you one. So he put one in Vienna, and he put another in Bologna, and he put another in Madrid, and in Berlin, and in Scotland, thinking that this, in a very subtle way, could start unifying people through education. The meetings that he had here for peace and how to have arbitration, don't have guns, talk it through, you know.
And then he understood, as you see from his diaries, that a war, a great war, would not be a lightning campaign like the Prussian-French War. It would be a huge industrial conflict. Rather like the American Civil War, which obviously he lived through as a young man. And he had that absolute understanding, which very, very few others of the crowned heads or the leaders of the governments in Europe understood. And
Yeah.
so his insight must have come from the understanding of the great power of industry and that complex.
When he realized he wouldn't be able to give it all away, and he founded the Carnegie Corporation and put his money there, the preamble to this thing was it's established for the advancement, but the assimilation of knowledge and understanding. It was extremely frustrating for him because he could see it. And there were others. He wasn't alone, but he was one of the most vocal. Imagine giving $10 million to build the Peace Palace in The Hague, of all places, in the Netherlands, hoping this is where they can settle their differences, you know? And he built another one in Washington, And it must have been just heart-wrenching when he realized it's not going to work.
So the Great War did break out.
It did.
He foresaw the calamity and effectively the end, to a great extent, of European supremacy of the world, at least unchallenged supremacy. And Carnegie returns to America effectively heartbroken.
Right. He almost becomes a recluse in a house called Shadowbrook in Lenox, Massachusetts. If you stand up there, it burned to the ground in 1957. Mrs. Carnegie sold it to the Jesuits, who turned it into a school, and then mysteriously burned to the ground. But if you stand there, you can almost see the Scottish Highlands in the Berkshires. He realized that this was going to be his last view of home before he died.
And his own assessment of his life, is there any understanding of that? Is there any sort of last message as he reviewed the extraordinary contribution he made, or did he die obviously heartbroken about the war, but was he dissatisfied with what he'd managed to do?
I'm not sure anyone of that caliber is ever satisfied. It's always more, you can do better, always. I used to see that backstage all the time. Can't imagine Carnegie not being any less.
Gino, that's been fabulous. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
But before you go, I haven't studied Carnegie and whiskey, but I'm sure he would have approved of the Quake in terms of the concept of the loving cup. So you know the drill.
I do.
Whiskey and the Quake only from the Scottish Highlands.
And in fact, Catherine just brought me back some.
Well, in that case, you've got the whiskey, and now you have the Quake.
Thank you so much. This is perfect timing. It's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the interview. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure.
From Carnegie Hall to the streets of New York. Next week, in the second part of this show on the influence of Scots in America, we look at this year's Tartan Day celebrations. And I speak to some modern Scots following in Carnegie's footsteps and making their own mark on the cultural life of the Big Apple. Make sure you join us then. It's lively stuff.